Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Simon, and thank you all for joining us today. It's fantastic to see a packed room. And I'm thinking, wow, what a start to the day. Who gets this scene every day? And it's, wow, what a start to Q4, in fact. So we've got a packed Q4 as well. So it's really timely that we've got this daily dose starting on the beginning of quite a tumultuous year, full of certain uncertainties, full of vulnerabilities, and we'll be unpacking those around Europe over the next hour or so. And, taking a step back, what is this Q4? What does it hold for us? Well, in a few weeks, Simon mentioned Brexit. Are we going to crash out? Or are we going to stay in? What does that mean for corporate Europe? What does that mean for corporate Britain? A whole host of other things as well, though. Japanification now becoming almost a part of business vocabulary. On your seats, you'll find an article from one of our journalists who wrote about the Japanification of Europe. Maybe that's something we'll be sort of tapping around, looking into over the next hour with our panelists. So a lot to be focusing on, but also just not closer to home, but also broader. So China, is starting its celebrations this week for its 70th anniversary. On the other side of the world, we have the U.S. and impeachment talks. What's going to happen there in an election year that's coming up? So lots of pressures, lots of uncertainties, and we will explore some of those. We won't get through everything we want to over an hour, but again, as Simon said, please do ask questions along the way. We'll have questions in midway point, but also at the end. And we can also really want to encourage you to stay and have coffee afterwards to continue those discussions, but also continue reading the daily doses and staying a part of our newsroom, which we're really proud of how we've been able to grow since 2014 to bring you all the news, that the need-to-know news across the sectors. So before we dive in with all the hard work that we've got over the next hour or so, I want to ask the audience, just a show of hands, just to gauge what your mood is. If you think about this time, or so at the beginning of the year, and what your confidence level was in the European economy, would you say your confidence level is higher today, lower today, about the same, or you have no idea? So show of hands. Better, it's higher. Okay, I can sort of gauge where the pessimists and optimists are in the audience. Worse. Wow, okay. Now that's interesting. We've got, so hardly anyone, I'm going to say no one, 0% more optimistic. I would say more than half pessimistic. What about don't know? A few? About the same. Okay, a few more. Okay, so definitely the pessimist outweigh the optimist. We've got some exploring there, and I definitely want to know what our panelists think. And I'm delighted to be joined today by a terrific group of experts to help us unpack these topics and understand why you are feeling pessimistic and maybe why you might not feel so pessimistic at the end of this discussion, maybe. So to at the far right, your left, is John Cronin. He's a financial analyst with Goodbody Stockbrokers. To his left, in the middle, is a colleague from S&P, Tim Edwards, who is the head of a unit of the S&P Dow Jones Indices, which is a sister organization to Market Intelligence. And to Tim's left is Peter Dixon, a financial economist with Commerzbank. So I'm going to start off by turning to Peter first, in fact, to help us set the scene a little bit. Understand, so we're at the end of Q3. What are we seeing in terms of economic uncertainty and the vulnerabilities? So Peter, can you help us set the scene a little bit?
Okay, thanks, Janet. Good morning, everybody. I would characterize the world that we live in today not just of one of uncertainty or even risk, but as a disconnected world. We have significant disconnections between the performances of various economies throughout the world, different regions. We have a significant amount of disconnection, I would argue, in the world of policy, where much of the heavy lifting to get the economy back on track following the recession of 2008-09 has fallen upon monetary policy, and we've now got the bizarre spectacle of 10-year yields in Germany in negative territory. So in effect, we're being asked to subsidise German government borrowing. I mean, that's a very bizarre world. So arguably, the policy mix that we currently face is highly imbalanced, and I would argue that there's room for fiscal policy to help us out here. There are disconnections in marketplaces between asset valuations and what we think are the fundamental, the fundamentally justified levels. And I would argue too that the biggest risk we face, or uncertainty if you like, is geopolitical disconnections where we have Brexit and Trump on the one hand, we've got rising nationalism across Europe, and all of these things are affecting the way in which we think about the global economy and financial markets. And I think I just want to pick up on one final point before I pass on. I mean, it's interesting that the balance of responses today with regard to the European economy is significantly more negative than I think we thought at the start of the year. And I have to hold my hand up and say that at the start of the year, I seem to remember writing somewhere that I didn't think that we would see a recession in Europe this year. Judging where we are in Germany right now, it looks very likely that the third quarter posted a second consecutive contraction in GDP, in other words, a technical recession. And I think that is very, very much symbolic of, A, the economic difficulties that we face in Europe, and B, I think is, because the cause of that slowdown is primarily the backwash of the US-China trade dispute, I think it's another symbol of how the geopolitics is beginning to wash up on our shores. And I think there is going to be a lot more to come, particularly as we go through this process, and of course, as we started to talk about the implications of Brexit.
So, Peter, you put that into three neat buckets, and I know our world is not that tidy, but you're talking about sort of economic uncertainty, and then policy uncertainty, and then political uncertainty. And I think, this time last year, we wouldn't have been talking that much about political uncertainty and its influence in corporate performance. But I'd be interested to hear from you when you're talking about sort of, you didn't think that we'd be in recession. I mean, it's true, the recession word wasn't really being used. What have you seen? What is it? Surely is it the China-U.S. trade spat? Is there something else going on there?
Well, bear in mind that we're talking about Germany specifically here, but obviously that has major knock-on implications for the rest of Europe. But I think if you look at what's been happening in Germany over the course of the last probably 12 months, if you think back 12 months ago, the German auto industry started to register significant weakness in output, and we thought, okay, this is a transition to the new registration process for the way in which emissions are handled within the sector. So we thought there would be some short-term disruptions to the production data. It turned out that slowdown was a lot more prolonged than we had anticipated. And as it's become evident now that as export orders continue to decline, that Germany in particular, as an export-focused economy, is suffering from the backwash of the US-China trade dispute. And I think if you look at global trade in a bigger picture perspective, I track an index published by the Dutch Central Planning Bureau, and that has shown, or that now shows, that year-on-year growth in global trade is now flat, and that's pretty spectacularly bad. I mean, you have to go back to the collapses of 08-09 to see a worse performance, and even that was a great exception. So it looks like now that the global trade is certainly at its weakest in at least a decade, and I would put that down largely to the international trade disputes that are now beginning to bite.
Interesting. Let's definitely explore that a bit more. In the meantime, though, I'd be really interested to hear from Tim about more sort of, given that backdrop, what's happened in the markets? How have the markets reacted to all of this?
Yeah, so I guess I probably need to confess I'm something of an equities guy. which means that I'm at risk of unbounded and unsupported optimism. But there are some silver linings here. I don't know how many of you would have put your hand up to say it's much worse, or the outlook is worse for Europe at the beginning of this year. But currently, the European equity market is on track for its best year since 2009. Our broad-based equity index for Europe is up 20%. The UK is up 14%. If you look across developed markets, I think there's only two, Luxembourg and Korea, that haven't got strong gains this year. As you have gains in every sector, you have gains in nearly every country. The US equity market is soaring. When you go to some of the traditional concerns of the European economy and you pick, for example, Italian bonds. Well, Italian bonds, excuse me, they have had the best quarter, this last quarter, since 2012. Our index for Italian bonds is up, I think, 7.5% in a quarter. So it's sort of gloomy outlook, but then if you actually look at what the markets are doing, the markets are really happy right now. So what's going on? Well, there's one obvious thing to say. There's one more sort of subtle perspective in terms of what's under the hood. And then there's something else to say about your point on disconnection. The first and the most obvious thing is, look, central bank support is so important in that. You can talk about the European Central Bank, the Japanese Central Bank, and the US Central Bank. Money is moving around, right? And they are all watching, the central banks are watching what each other do. And easing from one bank helps the global markets. But the Federal Reserve significantly miscalculated towards the end of last year, recalibrated, and is now giving the market what it wants, or at least largely giving it what it wants. The equity markets just want more all the time. The European Central Bank moving rates further negative and announcing, restarting asset purchases. That is a significant driver of this. Because when it comes to asset allocation, we are getting back close to that notion of there is no alternative. When you cannot get a return for giving Germany money for 30 years, what are you going to do? Right? You have to make money somehow, particularly on the pension side, where their return expectations are frankly unrealistic. They really have to go and find returns. So I think that there are more subtle aspects, but if you're just going to pick one reason why the market's up so much, it's central bank support.
It's interesting. But does that feel more? Sorry about that. Does it feel more like a short-term response, though? Just because is it the market thinking short-termism and not trying to price in? This is as good as it's going to get, so we might as well make the most of it for now.
Well, you see, there's a lot of different participants in the equity markets. Some of it is definitely, this is what we want to be doing right now, right? This is the trade to have, and there's a momentum trade going on. But that's a really hard thing to untangle. Yeah. The price is up because it's good right now, or price is up because of a long-term optimism. Yeah. But when you look under the hood and you say, okay, well, which parts of the equity market are doing well, then it gets much more interesting. Because typically in a bull market, the market is driven up by growth, and it's driven up by the more high beta sectors like technology, financials. So far this year, the market has been led up by the pedestrian sectors. Utilities is the best performing sector in Europe. Right? You should not see an equity market that's up 20% and a utility sector that is leading it. Right? This is just not usual. If you look at the US, the same story is happening. In fact, the best performing index we have for the US is something called the S&P 500 Low Volatility, which picks just the least volatile stocks. Right? So that should be challenging. Right? Because this is not a normal bull market when the things that are really driving the market up are the most defensive, protectionist, high dividend, low volatility, utilities, real estate. Those parts of the market are driving the gains. So that tells you, and that is some support of this notion that the purchasing demand in equities is not really for equity growth. It's because there is no alternative and they need to buy something that they think might go up. That's sort of the second thing to point out. The third thing to point out, which is much more subtle, which is on the point of disconnection. So if I allow myself to pick a reasonably long-term horizon, so compare where we are now to say 2013, the main difference in the markets between now and 2013 is that previously, and you'll actually see this in media analysis, previously one single story could be used genuinely to explain everything that was happening. And I said earlier, look, if you're going to pick one reason, pick central banks. In 2013, you would open the newspaper, Financial Times, whatever news article you said, the oil price did X because the Fed did Y. And then you turn the page. The equity markets did X because the Fed did Y. And central bank sentiment and activity was driving every single market. And the way that this was most apparent was in correlations. Every correlation between any pair of assets was either +1 or -1. That has changed. Now, with the balance of trade, politics, and actually economic divergence in different parts of the world competing with the central banks, it's much more of a balanced picture. And actually, if you look at events like Trump's election or possible impeachment, if you look at Brexit, if you look at the trade war, it's not so much that the same story causes markets to go up or down altogether. It's actually creating winners and losers. And that is a very different and distinct market environment to the kind of rule book that you would have 5 years ago when it's risk on, risk off. And now the rule book is identifying which segments and which kind of factors within the market are going to benefit and which are going to suffer.
Thanks, Tim. I think that gives us some good insight, some surprisingly good news, in fact, but also pretty daunting because things are shifting, and they've shifted over a relatively short period of time post-financial crisis. So at this juncture, it makes a lot of sense to turn the microphone over to John to talk about, well, let's look at one sector. As you know from anyone who's done any of these Daily Dose Live breakfasts before, we always like to get experts from different vantage points. And so having someone with a sector focus going, what's happening with banks? I mean, this we've set the scene now for you. Are the banks the winners and losers, can we say, in Europe? And then drill down into the UK as well and what's happening out in the City of London.
Sure. I think maybe to begin with, look, stepping back in terms of the slower and pedestrian growth profile from a macro standpoint is clearly not constructive in the context of loan growth and revenue growth ambitions. So that's not a supporting factor. I think coming back to Tim's point in terms of the equity markets have seen a substantive rotation into defensives. Clearly some of the sectors that Tim called out, utilities with regulated returns and real estate with long-term locked-in yields, the maths simply dictate that those are the sectors that benefit most in the context of lower negative interest rates. And I think, look, on that very point, I think the negative and lower negative rate dynamics from a Eurozone perspective, lower for longer in a UK context with question marks around potential rates becoming negative in time. And like, we can come back to revisit that point in more detail. There has been a lot of talk or divergence in views among Monetary Policy Committee members, but I think Michael Saunders summarised that quite neatly last week in the context of the impetus for rates to fall back potentially in a Brexit scenario, and those negative and that lower and negative rate dynamic is very unhelpful in terms of bank net interest margins particularly. So taking that with the challenge in terms of achieving revenue growth more broadly and looking at the declining spreads on assets and the net interest margin erosion as a consequence just becomes a multitude of headwinds for the Eurozone, and indeed UK banks are experiencing similar, if not precisely, if not the exact same dynamics. But there are some of the challenges to begin with, and look, drilling down into the reasons why the negative rates or lower rates are destructive from a margin standpoint. First of all, you've got challenges in terms of passed through to depositors in terms of lower rates. We're at the lower bound in the case of many European and UK banks, particularly those with substantive current account exposures. Secondly, it's been a key talking point in the UK for some years, but has risen up the agenda in Eurozone markets, is the net interest margin decay owing to structural hedges as the swaps roll onto lower rates. That means the bank is receiving a lower fixed level of interest and causes further net interest margin compression. And these are the factors that are really driving down consensus earnings expectations driving down.
I'm curious though about what happens though with the competitiveness of European banks and UK banks in this rate environment. European banks are having to park their excess capital with the ECB and they're losing billions every year, as opposed to US banks. Everybody knows, cost to income ratio is an ongoing issue for European banks, their lack of efficiency in comparison to their other global competitors. What's going on there? Is that a key? Is the rate policy really the key thing that's hampering competitiveness for European banking?
Yeah.
European banks aren't in the global stage as they once were, or might never have really been. They're ceding, places to U.S. and Chinese banks. What's going on there? Where are the vulnerabilities? Maybe it is rates, but is there more?
Yeah, well, I think just on that point, look, the negative deposit rate has been very damaging. Less so for UK and Irish banks, but much more so for French and German banks. And there is some in the latest ECB Governing Council meeting, we saw Draghi announce that some of the excess reserves can indeed attract the zero rate, but most of that benefit will actually fall for Italian banks as it happens. So there is some talk in the market about a potential change coming in that respect in due course. The wider challenges, I think rate is the predominant issue, to be frank, in terms of European banks, but there are other problems in the mix. And cost takeout, as you alluded to, has been a perennial challenge for banks. So banks have made substantive strides in some respects in terms of branch closures, staff cost reductions, and so on and so forth in recent years. But you've had the parallel development of requisite substantive investment in IT systems and right-sizing for the future, investing in alternative delivery channels in terms of banking product distribution to the customer base. So you've got a lot of investment on an ongoing basis, while cost reduction has been a key theme. The problem is the simple maths are, again, getting back to rate. If you have a 5% revenue decline, you need to take, and you're running with a 60% cost income ratio. Sorry if I maybe reverse the numbers a little. If you have a 3% revenue decline and you're running with a 60% cost income ratio, it means you need to achieve a 5% reduction in costs to get to the same absolute level of profitability. That's a real challenge. And actually, it's becoming even more challenging now that banks have been on restructuring programs for many years. So, there is a pretty damp. When I speak to investors, they're certainly not very bullish or optimistic in terms of the potential for significant cost reduction in the context of what we're seeing on in terms of revenue pressures. But one further point that's becoming an increasing part of the dialogue is Basel IV. So this is another headwind that's that the sector faces, and there are mixed views in terms of the end state impact on capital ratios. And maybe stepping back for a moment, capital ratios have been significantly strengthened since the global financial crisis. European banks are running with an average CET1 ratio of 13.6%. But there is a view that Basel IV will take 100 to 200 basis points out of that. And that's effectively where the risk weights have to be increased in response to output floors and a number of other factors in the mix there too. But that's going to pose a big challenge. And the dialogue with investors most lately is that these new regulations are being phased in over the 2021 through 2027 period, but most investors are talking about front loading in terms of ascertaining the impacts at an individual bank level, which is a headwind in the early part of the next decade.
Yeah, good insight into that sector for sure. So shifting the conversation a little bit more, Peter, I'd be interested to hear from you. So I mentioned Japanification. I don't know how common that word is being used for folks in the audience, but is that something, would you be able to shed some light on that? Why are we talking about that more now? And is this something does Europe even need to be worried about it?
Okay, I mean, it is a good question. Let me perhaps back up a bit. What does Japanification mean? Well, basically, as you probably will remember, 30 years ago, Japan was on track, if you remember, to overtake the US as the biggest economy within however many years it was. Of course, never realistic, but that was the narrative in the press. The economy boomed and bust, and the market collapsed, and Japan entered effectively a lost decade. Now, if you look back at what happened in Japan, I think that the story was that policymakers were slow to recognise the extent of the problems that the economy faced. It wasn't until the late 1990s, 10 years after the bubble burst almost, that the authority stepped in to think about restructuring the banking system. And then, of course, we talked thereafter about the potential for Japan to recover, and it never happened. Why didn't it happen? I mean, I would argue that one of the big problems that was unrecognised at the time, but we've subsequently come to understand it, was that demographics were running against Japan, mitigating against the recovery in Japanese growth. So, Japan entered a period of much slower growth, largely because the population is ageing and is now declining at a fairly rapid pace. Now, fast forward, 20, 30 years to look at where we are in Europe. We face a situation in which the economy, or the markets at least, boomed and then bust and recovered again. But the economy hasn't recovered. The economy has certainly shifted to a slower growth path prior to where we were in 2008. There are a number of reasons for that, I think. One of which is the lack of productivity growth. Here in the UK, just to give you some insight, productivity growth over the last decade has been broadly the slowest in 100 years. I mean, it's been that bad. And of course, when you don't have productivity growth, it's very difficult to get the economy to grow very rapidly without throwing a huge amount of labour input. And the problem is that across the whole of Europe, we face, you might not believe this, but we actually face labour shortages. Our population is beginning to age. It's growing much more slowly than it once did, and we just don't have the labour to push growth forward. And the problem that we're going to face in Europe is that as we have an ageing population, we have somehow to finance their pensions, finance their old age from a declining, well, not declining, but certainly a much slower growing labour force. So in that sense, we have a Japanification problem. And I think, as John's been discussing, I mean, we arguably have a Japanification problem in the banking sector too, in the sense that European banks, in my view, have been a lot slower to clear up stables compared to their American counterparts 10 years ago. So maybe we're at the stage now where European banks have to think much more carefully, in an echo of what happened in Japan in the late 1990s, as to how to sort of get the banking sector back on its feet. But I think that there was a sense from politicians across Europe. They keep telling us there'll be jam tomorrow, as they've been telling us for the past decade. There won't. The new normal is, I think, a much slower growing world. A world in which perhaps our prosperity will not increase at the same rate as it once did. And in that sense, I know policymakers are reluctant to talk about it, but I think there is some form of what we might end up calling Europeanification going on.
Great. Looking forward to that. Before I turn it over to the audience to see if you have any questions, I'm going to ask sort of to get your reactions as well. So I'd be interested also if we can talk about that productivity struggle. Is part of this problem the lack of investment in R&D? I read an interesting stat from, I think it was the OECD, saying, as a percentage of GDP, the EU as a whole is way far behind, let's say, China, probably a little bit behind the US, and Japan even. So there's a real lack of investment in innovation. Is that a factor, or is there something else going on there?
I mean, I think economists generally struggle to come up with a definitive answer to that question, but I think there are a number of issues. I think you're right. Lack of investment clearly is one problem there. But I think if you look, and again, I'm looking at the UK in particular because it's the extreme case, where productivity over the last decade has been virtually zero. And yet, output has grown. Why? Because we've thrown labour at the problem rather than throwing capital into the mix. Why has this happened? I think in some respects it reflects an unwillingness to commit to big capital projects at a time when there's a huge degree of uncertainty, and that's become much more pronounced over the past 3 years for obvious reasons. The second point about the kind of investment, there is certainly evidence to suggest here in Europe that companies that you might call, how do we call them? I wouldn't call them winners. They are technologically sort of more advanced companies and sort of less technologically advanced companies. The gap between them is widening. So what's happening? And again, I'm basing this on some OECD work that was done a few years ago. The sort of the high tech sectors, if you want to call them that, are investing quite heavily, and they're moving ahead. But there isn't the diffusion of technology throughout the rest of the economy that perhaps we have become used to, and that might be one of the other problems. We're just not simply getting the technological diffusion. Thank you. Obviously, my microphone no longer working. So we may not be getting that technological diffusion that we had before. So you know, there are, I think, a huge range of issues there, none of which I can pin down and say that is the definitive answer.
On that as well, but we're going to hit the pause button. Are there any questions out there? We do have a microphone, another microphone, I believe, roaming around. Simon's got it. If anyone has any questions, I've got a glare of light, so wave your hands vigorously and go ahead and introduce yourself and say what company you're from before firing away.
Hi, Vanya Damianova from S&P Global. The question is to Peter about your comment about clearing stables at European banks. What did you mean exactly? Is it about changing older staff with younger staff or with different skills? Or you meant more like legacy loans clearing by European banks? Thank you.
Sorry, I'm not sure I heard the question fully there, but in terms of, so you're referring to the productivity issue, I guess, here, right?
Yes.
Oh.
You said about it's similar like as in Japan, and
Right.
Japanification of European banking and clearing stables. So what they need to clear?
Oh, sure.
Staff
sorry.
or
Thank you. Sorry,
legacy loans?
yeah. Thank you. Sorry, I didn't quite catch that. Well, I mean, John may be better
Yeah, I'd be interested to hear from
poised
John as well.
to answer the question than me. So I'll give you my tuppence worth first, and then you get probably a proper answer in a second. But I mean, I think if you look at where the European banks have differed to the US over the past decade, is they were much slower to write off their bad debt, for one thing, in the same way that the Japanese were throughout the 1990s. So I think that I think is one of the things that the Europeans have to tackle. And the second point, again, John has mentioned this already, so he can say more about it, but it's simply adjusting the cost base of European banks to fit to the realities of the business situation that we now face. You know, obviously, our revenues have been impacted significantly by low interest rates or even negative interest rates, and we have a cost base which is predicated on the pre-2008 interest rates. So I think there are two things those are two areas I think which banks really have to work on.
John, did you have anything to add?
I mean, I agree. I think, look, cost management is vital. But again, constraints in terms of the ability for Europe's own banks to do much more in that context. Just as an aside, I would mention to Peter's point earlier, we do have, an NPE issue in some countries in Europe still, some of the southern European countries, and that, that's been dealt with very, very slowly. But coming back to the fix, I mean, look, I think an acceptance that it's going to be lower for longer and much slower growth, what cost takeout you can drive. But I think you raise a very interesting question, because it brings to a broader point in the context of what are the long-term structural solutions for the sector. And I think, look, it's very tied in with European Banking Union. There's been relatively limited progress from a European Deposit Insurance Scheme standpoint. The working group is due to report back again this December, but hopes are dim in the near term at least. Secondly, you've got the backstop to the Single Resolution Fund yet to be introduced. I think 2024 is the latest timing. And there's a view in the markets among investors that you really need to see substantive progress on both fronts to stimulate much needed consolidation in the sector and cross-border consolidation. There are some inhibiting factors. We can probably come back to it in more detail if necessary, but just to say, look, some of the new regulations, like around MREL and TLAC and single versus multiple points of entry on resolution, are inhibitors from a large-scale consolidation perspective. And I think some of those regulations need to be re-examined, because I think the only way Eurozone banks get to achieve a meaningful return on equity longer term is in the context of 4,500 banks, is driving consolidation across the sector. We've seen that in Japan, down to 365 banks or something like that. That's been helpful despite the obvious challenges they've faced. But there is a need for a long-term solution here, because return on equity expectations are declining. The revenue growth is absent. Cost takeout is relatively limited without wider scale benefits.
Can I if I may?
Yes.
So, I mean, if you speak about the broader European financial services, right, so including the investment banks and also the rest of the piping that goes in, so it's certainly true that they've had an absolutely torrid time of it, I mean, for a decade. But it's also true that they're very cheap.
Yes.
So, there's always that balance of, and I've read and been nearly convinced several times that, right, well, now they're so cheap that there must be an opportunity. You mentioned a regulation, and there are various things, sort of capital markets union. You mentioned technology and closing branches and replacing that with tech. What do we need to see before that cheapness becomes attractive rather than just an indicator of how horrible it is?
Yeah, I think, look, it's a really good question. I think stepping back, a sense that monetary stimulus is working, that because I personally believe the Eurozone is towards the end of its potential scope to, how much further lower can rates go without going negative and becoming very damaging. A sense that monetary stimulus is working, but more significantly, I think, look, on the technology theme itself, I think actually the advent of open banking and potentially thinking more widely around partnerships in an industry context with perhaps big technology firms, fintechs potentially at the edges, take a share of the economic pie, but can banks do something radical in that context to really drive competitive advantage, creating an environment in which there would be winners and losers, presumably, as there is a battle for the revenue pie. But I think that's something interesting in terms of an angle for the sector to attain some moderation in terms of ROE decline and potentially position certain players for growth, for share growth. I think in terms of where we are in the context of current valuations, they are very undemanding. And I think, look, there are a lot of, we focus probably on a lot of the negative aspects thus far in this debate. I think we'll probably come to some of the more positive aspects of which valuation is indeed one. It has been, everyone's been blindsided, so to speak, for the last 5 years. It's always the dialogue, if I think back to 2015, was, are we at the end of the regulatory juggernaut? It turned out we weren't. Get the sense that Basel IV does mark the end of that, but I'd be forgiven you'd be forgiven for criticising that view. And I think, look, again, if there's a sense that monetary stimulus is working, we get some stabilization, well then, I think valuations look relatively undemanding at current levels. But when you look at forecasts, they're unfortunately pretty bleak on a 3-year view, or a 2-year view more particularly in a Eurozone and in a UK context for EPS growth.
Interesting. Good points there. I'm going to ask if there are any other questions up here.
Andrew Ross from Global Garden. Mark Carney and the Financial Stability Board and the 42 central bank governors have all agreed that climate change and green finance is an absolute requirement, not an option. It's mainstream, not something casual. Why isn't green finance precipitating an avalanche of investment if the requirement is to invest 100 trillion by 2030? Why isn't it happening?
Good question.
It is a good question.
For all of the 3 panelists, I think. Get your views.
I'm not sure I have an answer to that as to why it's not happening, but you're quite right. And I think that part of the problem is, from what I can see, is the market for green investment is still relatively new. I wouldn't say underdeveloped, but it's beginning. But it's still not particularly well developed. It is beginning to gain traction. And I sit in meetings with folks who are talking about green bond issuances now, which they weren't maybe a couple of years ago. So that market is beginning to gain some traction. So I think investors perhaps don't understand the implications, perhaps, of some of these green products. Maybe they're getting there, but maybe they need more education. I think there's a bigger issue here with regard to fiscal policy. I'm increasingly of the view that just as we used the 1930s to build an infrastructure, there is a massive opportunity for governments to use the lowest interest rates in history to finance a proper green infrastructure. And whether that be different ways of generating electricity, whether that be facilitating the switch to electric cars, whether that be climate-proofing our coastline, whatever it is, I do think, and I wholeheartedly agree with you here, that governments are massively missing a trick when it comes to using their own balance sheet to generate a wave of green investment. Hopefully that will change.
Yeah, it's a good point, though, that the green bond universe is still fairly immature. In fact, I think there's a lot of, I think the EU is trying to work on its taxonomy, trying to make sure that when we talk about green investment, we're all talking about the same thing. But it's early days yet, and we've been slow, I think. Be interested, Tim, to get your take on it. There's a lot of noise in the markets around ESG. Are you thinking that that's actually going to be, sort of, you were talking about, well, there are no other investment alternatives, so let's just go for XYZ company, but can ESG play a bigger role there?
So there are several parts to that question. At the heart of it, you say, why is this investment not happening? And I think you can look at 2 points. One is private investment and the other is public. Where does 100 trillion come from? I suspect the answer is public, i.e. it is a question of politicians. And obviously the key driver of that is sentiment, the general public. What will they vote for? Now, I am not a pollster, and so we'll put to you as an equal, or perhaps someone else here is a pollster and can tell me. My sense is that the mood is changing, and the appetite and demand for sort of something like a Green New Deal is higher now than it has been at any time previously. But I don't know about that. Then you have private investment. There is, I believe, that sort of the numbers changing over time, but at the last time I looked at it, something like $60 trillion of capital, invested capital, which has signed up to the UN Principles for Responsible Investment. And for many years, I think probably for about 5 years, ESG was supposed to be the next big game changer in the investment markets. And index companies, asset managers, pension funds, were thinking and talking and questioning, how do I invest in a socially responsible and environmentally friendly way? But honestly, for a long time, there was a lot of talk and no action. And the money, the real money, does seem to be in motion. I'd say about a year ago that really started. And we started seeing institutions like the gargantuan Japanese GPIF actually putting money to work in ways that was systematically reducing investments in high carbon emitters and putting more capital into, because it's on two sides, right? There's investment and disinvestment and engagement, voting, right? Actually engaging with companies. So I think politically, I don't think, and again, I'm not an expert, I don't think we're there yet in terms of the genuine demand for a really significant, bigger than defence going into investment. I don't think we're there yet in the UK, but we're closer than we ever have been. I don't think we're there in the US, but they're closer than they have been. But the private markets are definitely moving, and that money is in motion right now.
Sure. I'd be interested, actually, we'll move on with the discussion, because I think ESG is a big topic in itself. But looking back to Europe's vulnerabilities and thinking back to the original theme, and we've been just talking about sort of the nascent ESG market, but we're also talking about lack of investment, not only from the banking side, but just in general in corporate Europe, productivity levels. So Tim, do you think, why invest in European markets? Isn't it is Europe losing its competitive edge at all, overall, because the US markets are looking a lot better, even as IPOs get pulled, et cetera, et cetera. So there's things going on there, but.
Well, I think Europe, frankly, has suffered over the past. I mean, we talked about Japanification. I would stress Japanification is not necessary. You may have a demographic challenge for Japan, and again, I'm speaking to politics here, which is not my expertise. But I think in the general public, there was a political calculation that we would rather have this sort of moribund economy than accept immigration. And in fact, the punt there was, okay, well, we won't allow immigration, but what we'll do is we'll invest in robotics. And that frankly hasn't quite worked out the way that many people in Japan thought it would. Europe has the skills and the universities and the education systems to support technological development, and has more of a favorable environment towards migration. But the reality is, so far, whether it's due to regulation or circumstance, Europe has not really developed those leaders in technology. And why is a difficult question, and one that I can't really answer.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure if you look at the top 10 companies in the world by market cap, none are European, and there's probably some.
But in the technology sector, I think of the top 21, SAP is European, a couple of Chinese, and then the other 16, 17 are American.
That in itself is telling.
I mean, there are some very simple cultural factors that drive that dynamic too, of course. I mean, it's been well documented around the attitude of US entrepreneurs towards foundation of businesses, and if you fail, try again. Whereas in Europe, we have that, which we've seen from a policy perspective as well. I'll draw parallels, that inertia, that lack of willingness to go our own way, and that more bureaucratic mindset, I guess.
Can we switch the conversation, actually, because I'm also mindful of time, and there's something that we haven't spoken a lot about, and I'm wondering whether we just are suffering from Brexit fatigue. But John, I'd be really interested to hear from you your thoughts on we go crashing out of the EU at the end of this month, perhaps. What implications are you seeing for the UK banking sector and the economy as a whole, since they're going to be tied to what's going to happen to their corporate clients? Have they already factored, have they already been prepared, or are we seeing something we haven't ever seen before?
Yeah, well, I think, look, I mean, in terms of preparation, I think it's certainly been the risk of a hard Brexit has been a talking point in the markets for some time. I think, look, the current discussion is centered on whether it would be a disorderly or a disruptive, which is less worse, exit. And actually, if you cast your mind back to early September, when the Bank of England wrote to the Treasury and set out its refreshed projections for the economy in a disruptive scenario, which is effectively a managed exit, it reduced the negative GDP growth attached to such a scenario to 5.5% from 8%. It has unemployment at 7% and inflation at 5.25%, which plays to the MPC's point around there's potential stimulus for rate increases rather than reduction, which I'm a little circumspect on, despite wage inflation prints. But getting back to the point, I think, look, frankly, the consensus view, and one cannot be overly scientific or prescriptive in this respect, but largely the consensus view is that outcome is factored into earnings expectations, certainly across the markets and in the case of UK banks. However, were a disorderly Brexit to ensue, and there are many permutations with respect to how that could manifest in terms of, and we see very different assumptions actually in the banks publish IFRS 9 forward-looking models and provide a whole bucket of assumptions with respect to various scenarios. And we see massive divergence in terms of some of the assumptions around key indicators like unemployment being very important there, particularly in terms of asset quality and GDP growth and so on. So there are a lot of different views in the market in terms of how a disorderly Brexit would play out. And I think, look, suffice to say that if there is a no deal and a hard exit on the 31st of October, I think that will be a net negative event from a credit and equity perspective in the European banks domain. I would also add that there's been certainly the average view of the market participant is that a delay would also be short-term unsupportive in terms of equity prices, which have seen a little re-rate in very recent weeks. And separately then, look, another potential outcome in the mix is a Labour government which presents various challenges and would be seen as a material headwind for European banks' longer-term earnings profiles.
Can I just add, I mean, we have perhaps 100, 150 financial services professionals in the room. Put your hand up, if you would, if you think your organisation has not got detailed plans ready to go for a no-deal Brexit. Well, I'm sorry, sir. So my point being, the damage for the financial service industry, if there is to be some, it's been done. It was probably a year ago, they could have come through with the deal and things wouldn't have changed. But rolling with a week to go, and these universal investment banks don't know if they suddenly need to move 200 people to Luxembourg or not, too late. I mean, those changes have the damage in terms of the UK financial services economy and whatever loss it might see has been done. And to your point, actually for the trading firms, a no-deal Brexit may be quite positive in terms of generating volatility, generating trading volumes. So it is much more nuanced as far as manufacturing, exporting. Different matter, but in terms of the financial services, I think they've largely prepared for this.
Tim, by your nature, you're an optimist. By my nature, I'm not in equity, so I'm a pessimist. But I'm going to turn the conversation slightly then and think, well, what can we look forward to? You've suggested a few areas we can look forward to, but be interested to know from you, Peter, can there be winners in the Brexit scenario or some of the scenarios that we're facing?
No. I mean, if we're talking Brexit, I kind of was hoping that I would get away without talking about Brexit this morning, because it seems to be the bane of my life, and I'm sure yours too. I mean, for what is now nearly 7 years, I've been looking at Brexit from an economic perspective. And nobody has yet given me a good economic argument why Brexit works. Just they haven't. Now, I understand there are political and ideological reasons why people might want this to happen. But Brexit is, in my view, and other people may differ, but I mean, it is taking an unnecessary risk with the economy, which I think potentially could do a lot of damage to the well-being of many people, particularly at the lower end of the income scale. So, you know, and by the way, I don't think we'll get a hard Brexit on the 31st of October, not the least for not the least of reasons of which it would be a breach of the law. But even if it were to happen, you would not see the sky falling in immediately. Brexit is a sort of boiled frog problem. You know the thing about you put a frog in a pan of boiling water and it jumps straight out. But if you put a pan in a pan of cold water and turn up the heat, it slowly boils. That's kind of how Brexit will work, I think, in the sense that the economic disadvantages will accumulate over time, in the sense that the relationships between the UK and the EU in terms of trading goods, trading services, common standards, common travel across the region, will become more manifest. So and again, I'm sure that people will disagree with me on this, but I just don't see any positives from a Brexit scenario. I'm sorry.
Interesting. We've got some time now to actually turn over to the audience for some questions, in fact. We've had two already. We'd love to hear from you if you have any further questions. Simon's got his microphone.
Hi, morning. My name's Robert. I work for a company called Export Action Global in Canada. I was just looking at the title of the talk. I mean, obviously a big risk we've got is the political divergence. In every state pretty much in Europe, one of the key vulnerabilities we have coming down the line is regulation. I mean, big banks are going to get slapped by socialist parties in the UK and elsewhere. And I think, Europe has to also start growing on its own steam and stop worrying about trade balances with elsewhere. And it's got countries like Croatia, Poland and Romania on its own doors that are completely underdeveloped and need massive investment. So, I mean, I'd be grateful for your views on that. We're talking about vulnerabilities and we're not looking at the reasons why. And Peter, actually, you mentioned something earlier, which is around productivity. Well, you've got huge companies like Jaguar Land Rover, which has massive capacity for cars, about 1 million cars. It's making about 600,000 cars at the moment. And airlines as well, huge capacity, but obviously not being utilised enough, so they keep going under. So I don't think productivity is an issue. I think clearly the problem we have is demand. We have lack of demand for these things, and that comes down to what people are being paid, and which obviously filters into people's anger and anguish about who they end up voting for. Their lot, and what do they get? And they go, well, I'm not happy with what I get, so I vote for the party of an extreme because I'm not happy with the central. So it's sort of self-fulfilling. If you don't help people at the bottom, they're going to vote for someone crap at the top, which filters into the market problem. So I think that's if you don't solve the bottom, you're not going to solve the top. Yeah? So I think you have to look a bit deeper. And I'll be grateful for your views on that.
Okay, no, I totally take your point there. One of the disconnections I try to talk about in more detail with clients is indeed this political disconnect one. And I think I mentioned before that I don't think politicians have been sufficiently upfront with the electorate about the magnitude of the problems they face, and they therefore haven't put in place perhaps the appropriate solutions to remedy many of the issues that you have talked about. And you're quite right. That has led to a surge in populism, stroke nationalism, whatever you want to call it, to the extent that last year I think 1 in 4 European voters voted for a party who could broadly be described as populist, which is quite a stunning statistic, and it's about 5 times the number 20 years ago. And it does indeed reflect the lack of political engagement with wider society. And yeah, maybe you're right about the productivity story. There is, I think, a sense of lack of demand. It's true. And it does come down in part to this idea that wage growth has been sluggish over the course of the last decade. Interesting statistic that I often trot out whenever the Bank of England talks about excessive wage growth is that real wage growth in the UK over the past decade has lagged productivity, lousy though that has been, by about 5%. So basically workers haven't been getting their fair share. So you can understand why people aren't very happy. And yeah, the productivity story is very long and complicated, and yeah, demand may indeed be part of that. Going to the wider issue on the EU and the regulation issue, I mean, I've talked about why Brexit is not good for the UK. I mean, I think we equally have to recognise that the EU has major challenges as well, which perhaps it hasn't faced up to either. There is a sense, I think, that the outgoing European Commission was at least aware of the need for more deregulation within Europe, more market forces. It will be interesting to see whether the incoming Commission takes the same view. But I think that bureaucracy, admin, it's a part of all of our everyday lives in a way that it wasn't, maybe 10 or 15 years ago. And certainly it is the case that that indeed, I think, maybe another factor which is sapping our productivity goals. We're spending time doing things for no apparent, with no apparent output.
What you said earlier about the rise of populism is certainly interesting, because again, would we have been speaking about this a year ago? Probably not, or 2 years ago. But it's the undercurrent, I think, what's giving people jitters is that it also has repercussions for the monetary union, because there are elements in a lot of these parties that are very anti-euro. So again, back to geopolitical risk, right?
I think Europe needs to tackle its attitude to debt and look, fiscal stimulus. We haven't spent a huge amount of time speaking about it today, but I think we need to, again, look, in terms of some of the poorer countries, you can imagine that fiscal transfers eventually will be necessary from the likes of a common Eurozone budget to make Europe work as a coherent, integrated whole. But I think fiscal stimulus to ramp up investment spend, and to your point earlier about in a green finance context too, I think Peter made the point that that could be constructive there. I really think we need to take a different view in the context of lower for longer rates on debt to GDP dynamics.
Yeah, interesting.
And we're seeing that in the.
I see. Is there a question back there?
My name's David Osman, UOB here. Question for all the panellists. Looking forward and thinking about this era of uncertainty, what are your expectations, medium-term expectations, for consumer price inflation, for wage inflation, and for asset price inflation? Or should I be asking about deflation, not inflation in those contexts?
It's good.
Well, clearly the economist should go first on that one.
Okay.
Then we get the optimistic view.
Well, I mean, it's undoubtedly the case, isn't it, that, I mean, we talked about Japanification. I think this is an interesting example of it, that Japan has struggled for years to get inflation back into positive territory, never mind the 2% that they're aiming for. And the ECB is cutting rates ever further because it cannot get it cannot get price inflation back towards the 2% target. And that speaks to something deeper that perhaps we've been slow to recognise. I think on the one hand, the opening up of global markets has created a global labour force which has put downward pressure on inflation or wage inflation in domestic markets. So we're not perhaps getting the same wage increases that we might have expected given our current point in the cycle. To give you some insight on that, I mean, one of the things which economists look at is the Phillips Curve. For those of you who don't know what that is, it's the trade-off between the unemployment rate and the rate of wage inflation. And the theory is very simple. As the unemployment rate goes lower, labour markets get tighter, labour becomes more scarce, and wage inflation gets bid up. One of the features across all of the industrialised countries in the last 20 years is that trade-off has become flatter. So for any given level of unemployment, the rate of wage inflation is lower than we might otherwise have expected. And that I think we struggle to understand whether that is a permanent feature of where labour markets are now, or whether it's a temporary factor determined by the current state of the economic cycle. My sense is, when you say medium term, let's say the next 5 years, I rather suspect that we might start to see a small rally in wage inflation, all of these exogenous shocks such as Brexit notwithstanding, for the simple reason that we are getting to the point at which we're not exactly running out of labour, but we're not too far from that point. Certainly in the UK, maybe it'll take a bit longer in the Eurozone. The other thing, of course, we don't know, which might act in the opposite direction, is the application of technology, certainly at the lower end of the labour market, which might actually reduce demand for labour. So it's likely that we will see sluggish wage growth, but not negative, sluggish price inflation, and I think an ongoing very loose monetary policy to try to combat that, which I guess will have significant implications for asset prices.
Certainly would have implications for the banking sector. John, I'd be interested to hear from you. Let's say we're facing a new normal here. Central banks are trying to figure out monetary policy versus fiscal policy. Where does that leave banks with, let's say, even QE? Are we going to see cheap money coming through, and is it going into the right places in the markets? Or what are we going to see over the next year that might give you reason for optimism or pessimism, or a bit of both?
I think that the latest QE is helpful in terms of, well, it's got many effects, but look, I think we'll see continued QE as the ECB has announced. That will continue to drive some level of asset price inflation. I think that's, but there are other counteracting factors, and some of the effects that Tim spoke about earlier are relevant too in that context around the hidden effects that drive down asset prices. The one other point I'd pick up on as well is, look, one of the problems from a growth perspective in terms of driving asset pricing forward particularly, and what the ECB has been trying to do with monetary policy, is counteracting the lack of spend in a European context. So we've seen savings rates migrate from 22.0% in 2013 in the Eurozone to 24.1% in 2018. So clearly the households are saving more. That's not, you can throw all the wage inflation you like at it. If that's a trend, it's hard to drive material asset price inflation, all else being equal. So I think that's another challenge that I think, together with fiscal stimulus, is something that would have to try and address that savings rate. And look, it's particularly acute in certain European countries. I think that's holding back the Eurozone.
Interesting. I think I'm really mindful of the time, but I think we can continue the discussion over coffee later on. But I believe there's one more question, and then we can slowly wrap up.
Hi, good morning. I'll try and keep it as brief as possible. Andrew Fellows, I run a small M&A consultancy, and I'll preface my question very briefly with a statement that I didn't vote in 2016. I was out of the country on business, so I have no view one way or the other. But three of my clients do. Global automotive manufacturer who says, if Brexit doesn't work out in an orderly way, I'm going to close plants. I won't say which one it is. It's not the ones you've seen in the press. Second group of venture capitalists who say, before I invest in hydrogen fuel or electric technologies, I'll wait and see, probably 18 months. And a third group of private equity investors, three of them who say, I'm not buying anything British for the next 2.5 years, show me what I can buy in mainland Europe. So if I look at the title of today's event, uncertainty is the big danger that's behind all of those. Should we see Brexit as something to be put back in its box, or something that could tackle Britain's vulnerabilities?
Who's that a question for? Is it for all three panelists? And we can wrap up there. It's a good question. So Tim, do you have any thoughts about?
I don't think Brexit can be put back in its box, unfortunately. And I guess I'm showing my political cards there. I think, one of the real challenges for the UK is to navigate its way through such a politically difficult situation. And I am no expert. I don't know what the route through is. But the other gentleman, one of the reasons why we have a rise in populism is because of economic inequality. One of the reasons why people voted for Donald Trump and for Brexit was, to give a poke in the eye to the liberal elites in London. That's fine. But you have to then listen, you have to do something. And if there is what is viewed, whether it is a stitch up or not, but if there is something that can be viewed or can be cast as a stitch up, let me give you one example of what I mean. So if there were in the UK another referendum, right? Whether it's yes or remain or leave or remain or a particular version of leave, I think we already know what will be the campaigning slogan of the Leave group. It will be, tell them again. And the Remain argument will be very difficult and nuanced. And can we put it back in its box? I don't know. I mean, it'll take a politician of skills which I do not see in the current array.
Great. So, John, back to Brexit again, and before we wrap up, do you think Brexit can be put back in the box, and does the banking system actually want it? On continental Europe, are they thinking this is great, this gives us a chance to shine and leave London out of it?
No, I don't think Europe wants that. I think, look, what Europe is also, and this influences the negotiation process around a deal, which Ireland is acutely aware of. Europe doesn't want this to happen and to turn out to be not so bad for Britain, which is a potential outcome. And that could lead to further casualties or fragmentation of the Eurozone in due course. I think there is a way out here. I think sense ought to prevail to the extent that there is a further extension to the withdrawal agreement to the 31st of January. That could pave the way for another referendum on the point. And look, from an outside-in perspective, what I would say is at least the public would be would be voting with a better sense of the facts this time round were that to ensue.
Great. On that note, I think it's time to wrap up. I think I've been given a lot of food for thought, and I hope you have too. Some of the takeaways that I have is definitely the disconnect is very deep and varied and nuanced, and it's not easy to always grasp what is actually is happening and going to happen, probably arguably more difficult now than it's ever been. But I think I speak for all of you that I will thank the panelists for helping us dissect a lot of the key areas around productivity, technology, where the competitive edges are. So Tim, Peter, John, I'd like to thank you very much. Thank you. And as Simon said, there is actually a water bottle waiting for you if you are able to take the time to fill out the feedback forms, which are very important to us. And we'd be delighted to have you join us for coffee and to continue these discussions. And thank you very much for having the time to spend with us. So see you again soon. Thank you.